can't make healthier choices until you know what choices are healthy for you. As women, we require more carbs to build these hormones in the morning or at snack time when our stomach is empty. Those are the times that you want to be the most careful about your carb consumption. And the best way that you can slow your carbs roll to your bloodstream is to add fiber.
Hey, Phoebe, welcome to the show. I'm super excited to chat today.
Me too. Thanks for having me.
Yes, girl. I love on your Instagram page that you say that you are the queen of healthy hedonism. I'm like, what that means, but I'm here for it and learn today what that means. But I was so excited to have you on the show because, good Lord, my first business in the online space, I'm a board certified health and wellness coach. And so I was working with women in the sustainable weight loss space. And so, good God, to carb or not to carb is like the holy grail of questions. And I think one that really, number one, God, there's so much misinformation in the health and wellness space, in the nutrition space around carbohydrates. And it's also the one that really, I think it's the topic that has most women who have a desire to better their health and particularly to lose weight that has them scratching their head and feeling freaking mad and confused and all the things. So we're going to talk all about this today.
It's tricky. I agree. I've been one of those confused people. That's why I wrote my latest book.
Yes, I love it. Yes, your latest book, Carbivore, 130 healthy recipes to stop fearing carbs and embrace the comfort foods you love. I got to tell you, there's probably a lot of women listening to this are like, God, that sounds amazing, but that sounds like a pipe dream. What's happening here? So I'm excited to chat about that. So just kind of diving right into this carb conversation, what's one common carb myth that you wish every woman would leave behind, especially those who are like in their midlife, right? Women over 40. What is a common carb myth that you wish everyone would just shut down?
Oh my gosh. I think it's anything that skews like to full omission. Like I can't eat bread. I can't eat pasta. And one of the kind of main things that I try to educate around in my book and in these conversations is it's so much more important how you eat certain things than the what, including bread, pasta. I mean, there's such a spectrum for all of those things in terms of the ingredients, in terms of how a bread was made or a pasta was made, that really does impact how your body metabolizes it and how that impacts your blood sugar, your digestion, so many other different things. So anytime that you hear one of those blanket statements or feel yourself making one yourself just out of pressure, out of some of the things that have leaked down into your consciousness from diet culture, just pump the brakes and have an internal question mark and be like, is that true? Do I really need to stop eating all bread?
Yeah. Well, so then actually this begs an interesting question though that I personally have always wondered about too. What you said was very interesting, which is it really depends on how the pasta was made and how the bread is made, which can be very confusing. You hear all the time like, oh, when you go to Italy, like you can eat all the pasta you want because it's made differently, or like the bread, like sourdough is maybe better than some of the other ones. So let's just break down this whole ingredient thing. And yes, should we be going to the Italian market to buy our pasta and not going to the supermarket? Like, what does this look like?
Okay, so I can break both of those categories down. And I think the pasta example is really interesting. And it was one that I didn't really know about myself until I started doing research for this particular book. So there is that adage that you go to Europe and all of a sudden, those of us with any sort of gluten sensitivity, I've not eaten gluten for over 15 years. I have Hashimoto's thyroiditis. That was kind of like what began my journey, kickstarted my journey in the health world. I personally cannot go overseas and eat these things as I'm just too sensitive, but I know a lot of people who can and who wonder, oh, like what is that all about? And I think the misconception, and this would have been a good answer for your myth question, but one misconception is that, oh, the pasta in Italy, I have an easier time digesting it because it's lower in gluten. And actually, the opposite is true, which I find to be really interesting. So what happens is when we eat certain dishes over here, bread and pasta being two of good examples, that are made in an industrialized fashion, it really does impact our digestion, just in terms of how quick these things are made and all the ingredients that have to be added or the processes that have to change in order to make that happen, in order for these big food companies to make more money. So with pasta, in the old school way that Nonna in Italy used to do things, What happens is that the pasta is usually left out to dry over a long period of time. So actually, I'll back up. So the funny thing about the pasta is that it is actually made from semolina or durum wheat, which is a higher protein flour, means more gluten because gluten is a protein. That is what gives pasta its elasticity. Like, we love gluten. Gluten is actually really great and from a culinary perspective in terms of making delicious bread, delicious pasta. So the Italians, they know what they're doing. So they use the higher gluten flour for their pasta to get that elasticity. But the difference, as I was just saying, is that it is a slow drying process. And that actually affects the composition of the gluten in terms of what ends up on your plate. So the analogy that I like to give, since I'm a chef and a cook first and foremost, is if you've ever kind of seared protein, let's say you've taken steak directly from the fridge, put it directly in a hot pan, you'll see that that dramatic change in temperature will cause the meat to really seize up, will cause the protein to constrict. From a culinary standpoint, you don't want to do that. You want to let your meat come to temperature and then put it in the hot pan and then remove it and let it rest and relax again. So in the industrialized fashion, when we make our pasta, we are not slow drying it in the sun for days. We are flash drying it. I'm not sure exactly the amount of time it takes, but it's really quick. And what happens is the gluten constricts and seizes up in a similar fashion. So it's once it reaches your digestive system, it'd be similar to your body trying to break down like a really tightly woven linen napkin versus like a loose knit sweater. Like, it's just going to take a little bit more work. And so a lot of people who really experience digestive issues around gluten, that can be part of the problem. And to answer your question from earlier, no, you actually don't need to go to the Italian supermarket to find slow dried pasta. I promise you, go to a regular supermarket and look at boxers. There's a brand called Rumo. There are a few others, and it'll say on the front either slow dried or lenta. And that's what you want to look for in terms of the preparation.
Such good information to know. And so we shouldn't be afraid of, because, everyone's always like, well, I just need to eat chickpea pasta. Like, I can't eat any, right? So we don't need to be concerned unless you have like a severe, right, like gluten allergy, like,
yes.
I mean,
see, this
celiac
does not
or something.
apply to celiac. The gluten is still in there.
Okay, right. And I personally don't even love chickpea pasta. So the difference is not necessarily it's how it's produced is really, yeah.
And you can still buy, again, if it's the gluten itself that really bothers you, you can buy gluten-free pasta. This is actually a really interesting conversation because it's an area where, again, the food companies have tried to manipulate what we think is quote unquote healthy. Now there's a million different gluten-free brands, there's chickpeas, there's lentils, and we're made to believe that these are much healthier options. In terms of the chickpea and the lentils, sure, like those are great ingredients. Legumes have so many things going for them. But in terms of your blood sugar metabolism, in terms of the choice of, if I choose chickpea pasta because it's higher in fiber and higher in protein, it's going to be better for my blood sugar than if I chose a gluten-free pasta or a regular pasta. That is another myth. That is false. And I can go and explain why if you'd like.
Well, yeah, let's just roll with it. These are like hot topics. So yeah.
Big overarching tip for making sure that our blood sugar metabolism is running the way it's supposed to, like a well-oiled machine, is that fiber is our friend. Really, other macronutrients in general, lean protein, healthy fats, they're also our friends. But fiber in particular is very protective when it comes to making sure that we don't have too much of a good thing all at once. So again, another big carb myth is that like we shouldn't have carbohydrates, but carbohydrates include, you would be exponentially increasing your mortality risk. A lot of carnivores might disagree with me, but I'm sorry, guys, like the overwhelming research and data is on our side, that plants are our friend. But, again, in today's world, in terms of industrialized food production, we do have a much higher carb count of sugars, particularly in processed food, than ever before. So it's very different than the way we were ingesting plants back in the day, even 100 years ago. And the truth is, 100 years ago, we were getting the majority of our calories from carbohydrates, from grains, from various places, bread in particular, from pasta, if you're in Italy. And, we didn't have a lot of these modern ailments that we do today. We didn't have these diseases that were a result of metabolic dysfunction like diabetes and PCOS and whatnot. really, it's not necessarily one piece of the puzzle that is reducing our added sugar, reducing the massive amount of carbohydrates that a lot of us are eating. But I would say your audience, probably people who are kind of immersed in the wellness zeitgeist and are feeling confused, are not necessarily in that camp. A lot of us are like feeling guilty about just eating a moderate amount of carbs. What happens is our body, when we consume a quote unquote simple carb, which is sugars for the most part, like they can reach our bloodstream within 5 minutes if we eat them on an empty stomach. So in the morning or at snack time, when our stomach is empty, those are the times that you want to be the most careful about your carb consumption. And the best way that you can slow your carbs roll to your bloodstream is to add fiber. It can be a handful of nuts. If you eat your fiber first, that's going to be even better, because what happens is that fiber makes its way to our small intestine, which is where we absorb all our nutrients. And it kind of creates this like sludge around our intestinal wall, which is kind of a gross mental image. But that sludge means that whatever comes in after it is going to enter our bloodstream that much slower. So I have this tart in the book that's like a raspberry lime Ricky curd tart. And when I'm making it, I'm like, this is the perfect analogy, because if you were to just pour like raspberry juice through a fine mesh sieve, it would be an unobstructed waterfall, which again is kind of what happens if you were to, let's say, drink a sweet beverage on an empty stomach first thing in the morning. But if you were to take the whole raspberries, which have seeds and skins, and again, all the fiber intact, and kind of muddle it through that sieve, you're going to have all of that fibrous debris coating the interior. And then if you were to pour the raspberry juice in afterwards, again, even though it's like similar ingredients, one with fiber, one not, it's going to be a little bit more of a drip, drip, drip trying to get through that sieve than it was before. So that is literally what happens when we eat fiber. So that is why we are always trying to add as much fiber as possible. However, when we again use any sort of processing, even if it's like a high-speed blender, or in the case of making pasta, like industrial grinders to create something that had a lot of fiber to begin with into a sort of powder, just think about what that looks like. It's not going to have the same protective effect as eating a whole chickpea. So eating that pasta, which is made from flour, not going to have the same impact as eating the whole chickpea. Just like eating almond meal or almond milk, even though on the back of the package it says it's high in fiber, just think about like physically what happens when you consume it. It's not going to have that protective effect. So it's not to say that these things don't have fiber that will eventually pass through to our good gut critters in our large intestines, but it's not going to impact our blood sugar metabolism. I mean, just try it. Eat a bowl of chickpea pasta on an empty stomach, eat a bowl of regular pasta on an empty stomach. And I don't guarantee, because everyone's different, you're just not going to see as stark of a difference than if you took regular pasta and dumped a cup of chickpeas in there. That's going to be what's going to really impact your blood sugar metabolism.
Well, and it's so interesting. We talk about fiber, and I think for so many women over 40, they're used to hearing get more fiber. I think for a lot of people, it's not really clear like why we need so much fiber, but it totally makes sense as far as the whole blood sugar conversation, because as our estrogen and progesterone is dropping, that does affect our insulin sensitivity. And so that affects the way that we process carbs. And so really, as we get older into perimenopause, menopause, this is why increasing our fiber, there's other reasons too, but that's a huge piece of the conversation as to why we need to really be getting more fiber in as well.
Right. And it's just, none of this is rocket science. If you think about it, like there's obviously a whole spectrum on processed foods. Chickpea pasta does not fall into like the category of highly processed foods that like people are outraged over and that are like truly very bad for you. It's just something to think about. Like even in your own kitchen, the more you process something, like if you take a whole vegetable soup and you puree it in a Vitamix or a high powered blender, again, like that fiber is already in microscopic little bits. It's going to be very different than eating that whole bowl of vegetables. But, again, everyone is different. It's a Goldilocks situation for most people because, I've written my book before this was all about gut health. And I know a lot of people on the IBS spectrum who can't eat a whole bowl of vegetables, like can't eat a whole handful of nuts. Like that's just, and so having a pureed soup is kind of a happy medium, or a nice, like kind of mealy cooked down soup is a happy medium. So you just have to find your strategies. I try and educate around is that there's so many different strategies. There are a lot of different ins for digestion, for blood sugar metabolism, for all these different things that you can really find your own, choose your own carb adventure and go from there.
Yes, I love that. Well, we talked about pasta, and I know there's so many listeners who are like, wait, you said you were going to give some tips on bread. So let's go back to bread before we move on. Yeah, bread is like, for the longest time, I mean, you couldn't pay me in my 20s and 30s, especially my 30s, you couldn't pay me to eat a slice of bread. Like, seriously.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Like, it was because it had been so demonized for so long. And I was also not in a healthy place regarding nutrition and diet and all that with myself. So tell us about bread. Like, what really should we be paying attention to?
Yes. So similar to pasta, whole wheat versus regular bread, if you buy it in at the regular grocery store in a plastic sack, it's really, again, not going to make that much of a difference. Even if you look at the nutrition label back to back, of course, the whole wheat is going to look better. But again, in terms of blood sugar metabolism, they're going to have the same effect. Like, again, the fiber is pulverized. The one difference I would say is if you find like a seed loaf that has whole seeds still on it or still in it, that will probably be a bit more beneficial. In general, I think seeds and nuts are like two of the most amazing ways we can get more fiber and offset some of the carbs in our meals. In my book, I call these things carb companions. And just to point you towards kind of the mindset of adding instead of taking away, like, let's just add some carb companions. So yeah, it's great. Even if you have that like white loaf and it has, you know, a bunch of seeds added, like, so that's a great carb companion. So then I would say kind of the quote unquote best kind of bread to buy, or the kind that's going to have both a better impact on your blood sugar and your digestion, is anything that's made with true sourdough. So honestly, you're usually not going to find that in a plastic sack at the grocery store. Even if it says sourdough on it, it's probably not made in the artisanal way that uses true sourdough starter. And the reason why that's important is a true sourdough starter is a bacterial process. And so that bacteria, again, it's a slow process. So my whole concept of slow carb, not low carb, it really applies not just to how you're eating, how your body is processing things, but often the slower the preparation does translate to slower carb once it reaches your body. So with sourdough fermentation, again, it's a slow process of a slow rise versus a factory method, which honestly adds gluten a lot of the time to speed up the amount of time it takes to knead and develop that elasticity. So what happens with the sourdough fermentation is that the bacteria literally will eat some of the gluten content, will eat some of the carb content in your loaf. And what results ends up being slightly lower in carbs and is a little bit easier to digest as a result. So it's kind of a twofer there. You can find it at the farmer's market. Sometimes there'll be like a bakery section of the supermarket that may have something made with like true sourdough, but you have to kind of ask and you have to kind of know that it's coming from a small purveyor. Because again, it's not scalable. It's a slow process, or you can bake your own, which is always fun. The third part of bread, and this goes for pasta as well, is just the idea of adding a carb companion. So even though it's probably not like the number one way, but even at a restaurant, if there's bread and butter, you're better off adding the butter than just eating the bread, because that's fat right there. Fat and protein help slow gastric emptying. So that means that food is going to stay in your stomach a little bit longer, which means it's going to enter your bloodstream a little bit longer because it won't be entering the small intestine as fast. So it doesn't have that kind of protective element of fiber, but it still does slow your carbs roll a little bit.
So what, just so I know, asking for a friend here. So what is the ingredient then that I look if I'm going for sourdough? Obviously I know like probably not going to find it at the supermarket, but like, let's just say, what's the question I asked to like the person at the farmer's market? Or
was this made from sourdough starter, a true sourdough
starter?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No, and that makes sense. And you were talking about, there's two terms you threw out here that I want to visit. One is you're talking about carb companions. So what are some of the other, I know you mentioned maybe some good quality fats or like some butter or some nuts. Like what are some other carb companions that people should, because I remember hearing, I think years ago, I love peanut M&Ms. And when I finally got the green light that like 6 peanut M&Ms has the same blood sugar impact as like a glass of milk or something like that. I think that was like the study. I was like, yes, I'm in. Okay. So, and it's because I know like the peanut obviously is the fat with the sugar. So I'm curious, are there any other like carb companions that you love to share with people?
I mean, it can truly be anything. Like any vegetable is a carb companion. I mean, I guess I'm going back to nuts again, but like nut butters, I feel like is a really easy one, you know, especially when we're talking about bread to add. Like an avocado toast would be like a great built-in carb companion. And then, yeah, in the book, I have kind of these different nut and seed sprinkles that will keep forever in the fridge, but also like for a month or two on the counter. And I feel like it's just such They're really easy recipes. They're only like 4 ingredients each, but they each kind of have their own spices, their own flavor profile. And again, it's just a fun way to experiment with carb companions, to not do the kind of like mental monkeying around it, but just be like, oh, I'm going to add this like delicious thing to my salad. I'm going to add this delicious sprinkle of like pine nuts and red pepper flakes to my pasta. So those are among my favorites. And also the reason why I love seeds is that it is literally like fiber, healthy fat, and protein in like the tiniest little package. And a little bit goes a long way. I know these ingredients can be expensive, but like think about chia seeds. I mean, 1 tablespoon is actually a lot of chia seeds. And so you add that to your oatmeal in the morning and it really does have a great impact. Let's see what else. I mean, I love any sort of like smoked fish or tinned fish. Again, great healthy fat, lean protein. And then, yeah, I mean, any vegetable.
God, you said pine nuts and red pepper flakes, and immediately I'm like, I must be hungry because I was like, oh God, a pasta with like olive oil and pine nuts and red pepper flakes. I'm like, that sounds amazing. That sounds so good. I know you talk about this. You just mentioned it a minute ago, and I believe you talked about this in your book, is the idea of the slow carb. And so can you just talk a little bit more about that? I know you've talked about just a carb, obviously, that is slower to digest. Is that pretty much kind of the crux of it? And are there certain ones that we should?
People throw around a lot of terms like simple carb versus complex carb. The word carb in general is slang. And most of the time, I would say like 90% of the time, people are misusing these things. Getting back to basics, like a simple carb is a sugar, sucrose, fructose, and glucose. Glucose is your most basic energy molecule, and all carbs are made up of glucose. Fiber is also a carb, so a carbohydrate if we're talking about the parent category. And then the other category is starch. So starch is usually what people are referring to when they throw around the slang term carb. So starches will include root vegetables, grains, and then anything that are made from them. So your pancakes, your bread, your pasta, as we've discussed. So starch is a chain of glucose. So all of those energy molecules. And all your body has to do to get the glucose, the usable energy, is break it down. And that can happen pretty quickly if there is no fiber involved. So fiber is also made up of glucose, because it all is. And the difference is that it doesn't get broken down at all. So fiber passes through our system. It can hang out on our intestinal wall, forming that beautiful sludge barrier. But eventually it's going to make its way to the large intestines where it feeds our microbiome. So all our industrious, good gut critters. So that is its main role. And it's really an important one. But the beauty of it is that, again, it does not affect our blood sugar at all because it's not getting absorbed. So your original question about slow carb is like, okay, so a starch is actually a complex carb because, again, it's multiple glucose molecules together that our body has to break down. People refer to white rice as a simple carb versus like brown rice as a complex carb. That's not true. Like all starch is complex carbs. But the idea is like, how can we make those carbs a little bit harder for our body to break down quickly? And the answer is always fiber. So the difference between white rice and brown rice is that the brown rice has more fiber intact because it has the bran and the germ intact, whereas white rice does not. When we're actually looking at our own habits, like I don't think you're going to notice that big of a difference between the white rice and the brown rice. Again, the place that we can really make a difference is to add more fiber in the form of whole vegetables, whole plants.
If you had to recommend one slow carb pantry staple that could really like keep your energy stable all day, like what's your favorite slow carb staple?
I mean, they would be like the nut and seed sprinkles in the book, or like any combination of nuts and seeds that you like to have on hand. Just like add those to your plate, like sprinkle them on. It's really easy. You don't even need to make like the recipes. You can just like sprinkle some chia seeds like on your oatmeal. You can sprinkle some pecans on your salad, some pine nuts on your pasta.
Love it. Love it. Love it. Love it. Well, I want to dive a little bit into your story just for a few minutes, your health journey and really how you share and how you really came to be where you are, and the work that you do is obviously very transformative, very personal. And so for women in midlife who are really facing some health challenges, which so many of us are, so many of the listeners are, whether that's hormonal shifts or maybe that's some chronic condition, what advice would you give them about really trusting their intuition and advocating for themselves in the healthcare system?
One of my favorite sayings that I kind of came by honestly when I was doing my own experimentations after being diagnosed with Hashimoto's, my autoimmune disease, is that you can't make healthier choices until you know what choices are healthy for you. So I know it's like we're about to hit resolution season. So many people are just kind of grabbing at straws in terms of what they're hearing on podcasts or what they're hearing out there in the news media and the wellness zeitgeist and just slapping it on to their daily routine and thinking it's going to save them or feeling compelled to be rigid and stick with this new routine. And I would encourage people to, instead of just like making these broad spectrum changes, say, okay, instead, I'm going to treat this as an experiment. I'm going to try this one change on for size for 1 week, 2 weeks, whatever the amount of time is, really pay attention and see if it makes a dramatic change. And this is kind of what I did after my diagnosis, because, you know, it was an interesting thing. I hadn't really had my foot or like dipped my toe into the holistic wellness scene or functional medicine or whatnot. I was diagnosed by my regular doctor and her answer was, oh, just like take this pill and like you'll be fine and go on your merry way. And I was very grateful to be diagnosed. It's actually quite rare to like have a PCP diagnose you with Hashimoto's to do the full panel. However, that wasn't a holistic answer in terms of what I could do to manage the condition. However, then going to the other side of the spectrum, the pendulum, I think swung a little bit too far the other way, because then when I started meeting with functional people, it was like this laundry list of things I had to change about my life, like turning my entire life upside down, which as a 20-something, I was like, I can't afford to like throw out the contents of my apartment and replace it all with like baking soda and cotton. Like, no, like what are the baby steps here? Like, I can't just like give up all sugar and alcohol and coffee. And I mean, I could, but I didn't want to. That's okay. And so, yeah, my question kind of going into that project, which was really just like, how is I going to figure this out for myself in real life, was when I came up with the concept of healthy hedonism, which is how can I make changes that do right by my body without giving up my life? How can I make changes that don't have a negative impact on my financial wellness, on my social wellness, on my mental health, because all of these things are obviously just as important. So for me, like when I was taking on these experiments and evaluating them, it was really through the lens of like, where does my health overlap with my hedonism? Where's that beautiful part of the Venn diagram where those things overlap? Because there's so many different self-care strategies and modalities. And I genuinely believe that the ones that stick are the ones that we genuinely enjoy. And if you don't genuinely enjoy it and it doesn't have a huge physical impact to offset that, it's really not worth it. And then I also think a lot of these things, like a lot of the diets that we're talking about with low carb too, keto and whatnot, like these are therapeutic diets. And it's a really important distinction because a lot of the data attached to them, at least in the early days, some of the studies are looking at more long-term things now, but I've also written a lot about low FODMAP for people with dietary issues. But these therapeutic diets are only meant for a short period of time. They're only meant for the experiment. So for 4 weeks or so, maybe 8 weeks max. And that oftentimes is enough. It's enough to kind of set you onto a higher plateau with your symptoms, get you moving in the right direction of healing. And then you really can find more moderation going forward. You can learn from the experiment. You can say, oh, okay, like I understand what these foods do to my body. And then you can diversify from there in a way that, again, finds that Goldilocks sweet spot for you.
God, it's so interesting that you bring up the point that these types of diets like keto and the research associated with is that they're really not meant to be these like long term.
Yeah.
And there's also like I think a lot of the research pointed to like particular health conditions that it was really beneficial for. It was never really, in my opinion,
it's not a lifestyle.
It was never meant to be rolled out to the masses as this lifestyle way of life. Like it's just mind blowing to me. I can remember I had a client a few years ago who came to me and her and her husband had been on keto for like 3 years.
Oh my God.
And she couldn't figure out like why she was actually starting to gain weight again. And it's because like with keto,
out.
well, yeah. And it's because like the reason also why it's meant to be short term is because nobody can stick to that in real life, like for a long term. And then even if you are doing keto quote for like your lifestyle, and listen, if you're listening to this and you do keto and you love it, listen, like you do works for you. But I think again, this is where we get into the dangerous kind of advice of like taking these types of things and making them, rolling them out for the masses, right?
Yes.
Like, I think it's just, yeah, I mean, that's
my biggest wellness pet.
yes. Well, maybe another lifestyle habit that people have started to adopt, which you, I think, talk about, is intermittent fasting. So I'm curious, like, I know you've expressed some concerns about intermittent fasting, especially for women. And I'm just curious what your take is on maybe some of the risks for women in midlife fasting. Maybe should they rethink their approach with breakfast for better overall health? And I will say, before we go into this, I was an intermittent faster for years, and it worked for me until when I turned 40 and I started intermittent fasting. And then I did it for a few years, and then it wasn't working for me because my body was like I was gaining weight or anything like that. I just noticed that as I started to advance into my 40s and my hormones were naturally shifting and my progesterone was dropping and all the things, I just wasn't feeling as good with it. And I was also I was listening to my body, which was something I didn't do in my 20s and 30s. And I was realizing I was hungry in the morning.
Yeah.
And so I don't intermittent fast anymore. I actually have protein when I wake up. I realize I don't eat a ton when I wake up, but I do have some protein when I wake up and some good fats. That helps me. I feel really good on that. So I'm just curious, what your thoughts are on it for the listeners.
Yeah. So back to the concept of therapeutic diets and the data behind them. Like, the second point of that is that a lot of the time the data is not for women. These studies are not focusing on just women. They're focusing on mostly men, maybe a few women, or all men. So that's something to keep in mind too. And I think intermittent fasting falls into that category as well. And listen, I agree. Like, I pass zero judgment if it works for you. It is 10 a.m. right now, and I did not have time to have breakfast. Like, we are rolling into this conversation, and I am accidentally intermittent fasting. In terms of intermittent fasting, first of all, there's such a range. Some people consider 12 hours to be intermittent fasting. Sure. And I mean, that's kind of my normal. I don't usually eat with less than that, but I don't think of it as intermittent fasting, and I'm not rigid about it. I listen to my body, and I eat when I'm hungry sometimes because life is crazy and I'm a mom. It's like this morning, it's like I don't listen to my body because I don't have time and I just carry on. But so the thing with intermittent fasting, and it does fall into a similar column, I think, as keto, is that whenever as women we are imitating starvation in any sort of way, it deeply impacts our hormones, particularly for women who are in our childbearing years. There's a reason why fertility doctors will tell you not to go super low carb, will tell you not to restrict in any sort of way, which would include intermittent fasting, because again, it forces our body into a state of stress. Even keto, the art of making fuel from within, of converting fat into usable energy, that's stress on the body. That's not as easy as just having glucose coming into the plant and using it quickly to produce our thyroid hormones and whatnot. And per that last point, as women, we require more carbs to build these hormones. Like, we have a much more finely calibrated system. And when our body thinks we're starving or whatnot, other things can go awry. And in particular, our stress hormones can increase. And that again has a cascade on all of our other important hormones. I'll also say, when we're in a state of stress, the origin, whether it's a passive aggressive email from our boss or a diet ideology that we're trying to squeeze into our life, our cortisol levels naturally rise. And with that, our blood sugar naturally rises. So it sounds all woo-woo to be like, oh, like focus on stress management more than reducing our carbs, because it's like not going to have as dramatic an impact. But it is something that if we are starting with a higher level of blood sugar to begin with, any carbs we eat or any decisions that we make that are kind of like outside the bounds of our normal diet are going to have a bigger impact on us. And the reason is biological. If you think about it, back in the day, we had our stress hormones as a protective measure because there was usually some sort of threat, some sort of big jungle cat or animal that we needed to escape at a moment's notice. And so what's going to help us biologically is to have heightened senses, and then also to have readily available energy for our muscles to use to get away. So our muscles, it's like fuel in a car. Our muscles use up glucose very quickly when we're using them. Also another like kind of carb mitigation strategy is just to use our muscles, not necessarily to think about food as like, oh, I got to work that off. Absolutely not. You are about to do a workout. If you're about to even like run to catch the train and you need a quick fix breakfast or something before, you reach for something that's either like more sugary or more carby than normal, that's probably actually going to be okay, because again, your muscles are going to be processing that readily available glucose and taking it out of your bloodstream quickly. So again, when we're stressed out, we're sitting at our desk, we're not using our muscles, but we have that biological response. All of that readily available glucose in our bloodstream is just going to hang out there. And it means that if we eat something else that forces more glucose into our bloodstream all at once, it's going to be at an even higher level than had we not had the stress response to our system.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I have to tie that back to intermittent fasting, but it's all to say that anything that stresses you out as a woman is going to have actually a negative impact on your blood sugar metabolism, even if like your original intention was for it to help.
Yeah, I mean, this is so, God, I preach this for years. I mean, this is why women in perimenopause and menopausal women, like they have to, it's a total shift in the way, this is why so many women, especially if you're struggling like with your body and gaining weight or whatever, like so many times women say, what worked for me in my 20s and 30s isn't working anymore. And that's because your body's not the same. So a lot of this high stress activity, a lot of this HIIT training and a lot of long bouts of cardio and the way that we fuel our body with nutrition, all of that has to change when you start approaching menopause. So thanks for breaking that down. Well, one of the last things as we start to wrap up here that I want to just talk about is because a lot of women, you share a lot about this just with even your own story, a lot of women struggle with like bloating and with IBS. And you've mentioned a term where you talk about carb tolerance in your book. And so what steps can women who really do struggle with IBS or some gut health issues or just some bloating, what steps can they take to really start to reintroduce carbs in a way that really supports their digestion and feels good for their body? How can they start to bring that back in?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a different, you're coming at it from a different angle. Because again, I think a lot of people with digestive issues really struggle with large quantities of fiber, may not have the digestive fire to break down like a super woody vegetable, which in theory, again, it's like the idea for carb tolerance for slow carb is to actually have things break down as slowly as possible in the body. But that's not necessarily going to help someone who has digestive issues, and especially not something like SIBO or IBS, where you may have bacteria in the wrong place and that may just like cause a lot more bloating and distension. So I would say don't stress too much about that piece of the puzzle. Try to eat as diverse a diet as possible. That's kind of the macro, my biggest like health mantra for both blood sugar and digestion. So even if you're someone who struggles with a lot of vegetables, a lot of plants, find any way possible to integrate as many of them as possible. And that can be, again, using your Vitamix to pulse that fiber into microscopic bits, because that might be more helpful for you. So I would say then come at it from a different direction. Come at it from some of these other lifestyle strategies. Stress management, again, being one of them. That is going to have a big overall halo effect on your carb tolerance. Sleep is another one that has a huge halo effect on carb tolerance. There's so much compelling data that shows that when we have a negative experience with our sleep, when we don't get enough deep sleep or REM, the next morning we could have the exact same breakfast as the morning before in terms of carbs and sugars, and we're going to have a much more volatile reaction to that if we haven't gotten enough sleep. So again, some of these things like feel, I think, woo-woo to people because they don't feel hard enough, but they actually really do have an impact. And then the one tip that I would say that really has another big overlap between digestion and carb tolerance is simply slowing down. So chewing your food. Again, the slower you eat, the slower that things are going to enter your bloodstream. Also, for someone with stagnant digestion, it just gives your machinery a little bit more time to work. And then instead of intermittent fasting, focus on meal spacing. So that's very different. So it's not necessarily going, a huge amount of time without eating for your digestive system to catch up, which can be helpful for people. with IBS. I will say like there is some degree of intermittent fasting that has been helpful for those people. But I would argue, and I've led a lot of people through this tip in my group coaching, but a lot of people will find a much more sustainable impact in terms of just spreading our meals out. So starting the day maybe with a really big breakfast, but then going 4 hours in between until you get to lunchtime. So that really impacts the way our small intestine works. So there's this nerve wave in our small intestine called the migrating motor complex. And anyone who has dealt with SIBO or IBS may be familiar because it's kind of like the crux of the hypothesis on why we would get SIBO, this like overgrowth of bacteria too far up in our intestinal tract. And it's because this street sweeper wave is what clears all the debris through this very long and winding path that is our small intestine. And even as I described with the fiber forming this literal shield there, that's great in terms of our blood sugar metabolism, but it's not great when that stuff lingers for too long. That's when bacteria can like pull off the side of the highway and be like, oh, great, there's like a really wonderful food source here. I don't think I'll move to the large intestines. I think I'll just stick around here for a while. So it's when the breakdown of that nerve wave happens, when we have too much lingering debris after a meal, that things can go awry. And the thing with the migrating motor complex that I think a lot of people don't realize is that it only kicks in during a fasting state of 90 minutes or more. So even if you're making good decisions for your blood sugar metabolism, even if you're not eating any carbs, if you're eating a handful of nuts or carb companions or seed sprinkles every half an hour because you're snacking all the time, your migrating motor complex is never going to kick in. Your machinery is not going to work the way that it was intended to. So I think it's really important. Some people are very married to snacking. We live in a snacking culture. Unfortunately, a lot of those snacks are super carby and high sugar and are going to mean that it's going to be even harder for you to make it to the next meal. I am very anti-snacking. I don't think it's necessary. I would rather people kind of build in bigger meals, whether that's quantity wise, like actually adding more to their plate, or just focusing on meals that are going to keep them fuller for longer. And I do think with women, it's that Goldilocks thing again, is that a lot of people who don't have any carbs, like don't feel full, but then, those who don't have enough fiber or protein or whatnot and eat too many carbs, that's going to affect your blood sugar and you're going to get hungry again a lot sooner. So it's finding that sweet spot where we can make it 4 hours to the next meal without being ravenous. And then a lot of people with digestive issues who do that really do feel much steadier in terms of their digestion, and then also much steadier in terms of their blood sugar as well.
Super helpful. And as you're saying this, I'm like, 4 hours. I'm like, I feel like I would be starving after 4 hours. I'm like, maybe I need to like up what I'm eating.
But you can start, it's baby steps. Like start with 3 hours and then see if you can stretch it. I think the idea that I get bothered by with intermittent fasting is less like starvation period and more the idea of squeezing all of our meals into like one shorter period of time, because that truly is not how our body is designed to digest.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, this is honestly, I know some of the listeners are like, this has been for me too, like so educational. I mean, I personally was totally nerding out on the pasta and bread conversation. Just had this conversation with my mom the other day. She's like, well, when you go to Italy, and I was like, what's the, what is the deal with that? But now I know the answer. So I know you mentioned, obviously we've talked about your book. You've got actually a few books, but we talked about your latest book, Carbivore. And I know you mentioned you do some group coaching. How can the listeners find more about you and like how to work with you and kind of some of your offerings? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I don't really do it anymore, but I'll tell you. So you can find me at Phoebe Lapine on Instagram. You can find tons of recipes and resources on feedmephoebe.com. And then I used to do a course twice a year called 4 Weeks to Wellness. It's actually going to be available as an evergreen offering without my coaching, but just to do on your own. And that's kind of my signature program that I've led hundreds of women through over the years. And that was kind of a mini program that was stemmed off of my book, The Wellness Project, which was when I did all of those little experiments on myself. And I've kind of crammed a lot of my favorite ones into a 4-week period. So again, allowing you to just try on different things for size week by week and see what really has a big impact. And I also, if you go to thewellnessproject.com, you can find that. And you can also find, I have a lot of low FODMAP meal plans for those people who are dealing with SIBO and IBS. And then, for Carbivore, go to carbivorecookbook.com, because unfortunately we are dealing with major autocorrect issue across the board where Carbivore will autocorrect to carnivore. So if you're Googling it, just be warned, it happens on Amazon. It happens everywhere. So if you want a link to buy, you're better off just going to carbivorecookbook.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for being here and just sharing your work and your wealth of knowledge. I appreciate you so much.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Absolutely.